In this video, you are going to add the correct icons to your files and folders and calculate their size. So let's start with the icon. So we will need to find out if the element is a folder or a file so that we can choose the correct icon. So that's icon for files and the icon for folders. So let's go ahead and do this. So to find out if our element is a file or folder, again, we're going to use the start method of the file system. And we're going to use the sync version so that we wait for the output before executing coming code. So far we added the name and the link. Okay. And now we're going to move to the icon. Okay, that's better. All right, so now for the icon, we're going to create a variable stats, which will set to the output of our start function. So again, we're using the sync version. And what you need here is the full static path of the item itself, not the folder. So we're going to need to build that. So let's call that item full static path. So to build this, you will need the full static path of your folder, and then you add the name of your item. And you can guess that we're going to be using path.join again. Okay, so const this variable equals the output of path.join. So you're joining the full static path of your folder and the name of your item, which is item. What we're doing here, we are getting the starts of the item. Now you're going to add a different icon depending on whether your item is a file or directory. So let's check if it's a directory. So if starts is directory, then we're going to add the correct icon. Else, if starts is a file, then we're going to add another type of icon. Now, we need to be careful here. When you're using the sync version of these methods, we will always place this inside a try catch statement to handle errors in the proper way. Okay, so we just console.log the error if you get any error. And if you want, you can also set the main content variable to something like a div of class alerts and alerts danger. Okay, and write something like internal server error. And get out of the function by returning something like false, or just return if you like. Okay, now let's get the correct icon. So we're going to define a variable here, icon, which we will set in each scenario, and then we'll use it later in our HTML code. So if it's a directory, then we'll set the icon to something, and then we'll check if it's a file. So let's start with the directory. So I'm going to inspect this element and get the correct code from there. So that's the code. I'm going to copy it, paste it there. And if it's a file, let's inspect that element. And here we go. That's what we want. Now the syntax we're going to be using is slightly different from this one. We're going to use the ion icon tag like that. All right. So, and in our HTML content, we can add the icon just before the anchor tag. Like this. Okay. So let's see if we've got all our modules included. Okay, so let's test our code. So again, we've got an error. Stats is not defined, so this is due to block scoping. So let's define stats right at the beginning, like that. So let's try again. And here we go, we can see our icons there. So we're not getting the correct icons there, and that's because I missed the parentheses here. So let's start again and try our code. And this time we're getting the correct ones. All right, now let's move to the next step, which is calculating the size of your files and folders. So this will be done in a different way depending on whether it's a file or a folder. If it's a file, we're going to use a straightforward method using the fs module, which will give us the correct size of the file. If it's a folder, the fs module doesn't have an easy way of doing that. So we're going to need to go back to the command line using another node module. So for each type, we're going to write a different function. So for the directory type or the folder type, we're going to use a function which we'll build called calculate size d for directory. So this function will take the parameters we need and will give us the size of the directory. If it's a file, then we're going to use another function, calculate size f for file. So when you calculate the size of an element, you will need to show the size in a human readable format. But also you will need to hide somewhere in your HTML the size in bytes, because later on you want to be able to reorder your elements by size, right? So the same thing applies to the name. We will use the name in the HTML code to display the name, and also we will place the name somewhere in our code so that we can reorder the elements. So we'll come back to that in a bit. So let's go ahead with the size. So since you need both the size in bytes and the human readable format, this means that you're gonna need two values. So our function calculates size d is going to return an array where we're going to store two variables. So let's call the first variable file size. So this is the one that you want to display on your page. And the second variable, I'm going to call it file size bytes, which is going to be the size in bytes. Okay, and the same thing applies to the file version. So instead of calling this file size, you can call it item size if you like, instead of file. All right, that's better. Now let's create a JavaScript file for each of these two functions. So let's start with this one. So we're going to call the file the same name of the function. I'm going to place the file in the same location as respond.js. So that's the first one. And that's the second one. Okay, so let's start with the first one. So let's define our function calculate size d, which will take parameters and then we'll execute some code. And then right at the end, we'll export the function calculate size d. Now to link this file, we will add a constant requiring the path of our JavaScript file. So the path starts from the current location and then goes to calculate size d.js. Okay. So to calculate the size of a folder, you mainly need the full static path of that folder. And the full static path of the item itself is the item full static path variable, which we created earlier. So what you need is pass this variable to the function calculate size d. So our function takes one parameter and will return at the end an array of 2 elements. So to test our code, let's just start with something like this. So 110 megabytes for the human readable format, and in bytes, let's set that to 110 converted to bytes. So this will depend on which system you are working on. So the conversion will be either 110 multiplied by 1000 and then multiplied by 1000. And this is the system used by my computer. Now on other systems, it would be 1024 by 1024. Okay, so for now we will keep this one. And let's go back to our main content file, and we will use the value of item size in our table row. Now before trying our code, let's comment this line because we haven't defined calculate size f yet. And also we can improve our code. So instead of having to define these two variables outside this scope, again, we can define a global variable there, or a global object. So let's call it item details, for example. So we will set it initially to an empty object, and then instead of icon, we will use a property of item details dot icon, which we will set to any value we need. So instead of icon, we're going to have item details dot icon. And the same thing applies to stats. So item detail or details.stats. Okay, and let's do the same thing with the size variables. So instead of item size, you can just use size instead. And the same thing there. Okay. So let's just copy this and change the function to calculate size f. Now let's just scroll and see if we still have anywhere we didn't include the item details. So this one. Okay, so let's save our code, and now let's try. So it says here the size is undefined, and that's because we changed that to size instead of item size. So let's try again. And here we go, we get 110 for all folders. Okay, so this is only for folders. You'll get undefined for files, and that's because we haven't calculated the size of files yet. So let's go back to our file, our function calculate size d. Now, as we said earlier, calculating the size of a folder using the fs module is not something straightforward. So we're going to use another module which is called child process. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the playground, create another file that I'm going to call child process.js, and here we're going to write some code and play with this module. So to require the module, let's define a variable child process, which we'll set to require child process. So the method we are interested in is called exec, and we're going to use the sync version. So let's try child process dot exec sync of a certain path. So basically what this function is going to do, it's going to execute any command that you pass to it. So what we're going to do here, we're going to write a command that we would write in the command line, and we will get the outputs which we can manipulate in our code. So let's try a simple command, pwd, which will tell us where we are at the moment, and we will use the method toString to get the outputs as a string. So let's save and stop the app, and then run node playground child process.js. Okay, so we will need to console.log this. So let's try again. Okay, so this is the results we are getting. So it's telling us that we are inside this path. And this is the same result that I would get if I typed pwd right here. Okay. All right, in the next video, you're going to run another command which will calculate the size of a certain folder on the computer, and then we will be able to use the same method in our project.